Brooklyn Independent Television.
Two things we know for sure about 2012. Unemployment will still remain high, and it's an election year. A solid guarantee that the word we'll hear more than any other will be jobs. Finding and keeping good jobs are a priority here in Brooklyn, of course. But which industries and business sectors have weathered the recession, and which hold out the best promise for growth? Here to tell us about recent trends and offer some educated guesses is Lesley Hirsch, Director of the New York City Labor Market Information Service at the CUNY Graduate Center. Lesley, thank you for being here.
Thank you for having me, Randy. It's a pleasure.
So big picture, are we still in a recession or not?
Well, we're not in a recession according to the National Bureau of Economic Research, but they determine the begin and end of economic cycles based on a lot of other things other than employment. But as far as employment is concerned, employment recoveries typically lag behind national recession recoveries, and lately they've been lagging way longer than they were in the earlier part of the century. So yes and no is the answer. We're still in an employment recession. We're still about 2% below where we were at the beginning of the recession, New York City wide. Some places are, some industries are doing better, some are doing worse.
So New York City wide, where have we seen some positive trends and where have we seen some negative trends?
Well, I think going back to the recession, if you don't mind, we can look at what happened during the recession. During the recession, the typically resilient industries did well. Those are, healthcare and social assistance, meds, also known as meds, educational services, known as ed. So the expression is Eds and Meds always do well. Those did well. Those were the only ones that did well across the city throughout the recession. This picture was very, very different in Brooklyn, though. In Brooklyn, about half of the industries kept adding jobs. Eds and Meds did well, but so did accommodation and food service, retail. The only ones that did really poorly across the board in Brooklyn as well as in New York City, manufacturing, construction, information, and some of those really have to do with long-term secular trends.
So break down sort of Brooklyn jobs for us for a minute, both pre and post-recession.
In Brooklyn, you're like a mini-me of New York City. New York City has a heavy concentration of jobs in government, jobs in healthcare, and jobs in retail for that matter. But New York City also has a heavy concentration of jobs in professional services, and as we all know, finance and insurance. Brooklyn has a much stronger reliance on healthcare and social assistance. Fully 1/3 of all jobs in Brooklyn, even more than 1/3, are in healthcare and social assistance. And then you have accommodation, which is hotels and restaurants, and then retail. That makes up about a little bit more than half of all jobs, those three sectors. The rest, information, professional services, finance, all of that, they make up slivers, 5% or less of the labor market in Brooklyn.
So that's a big difference from about a decade or so ago, when manufacturing, for example, was a much higher concentration of employment.
Absolutely. Over the last 50 years, we've lost something like 90% of manufacturing in New York City, and that obviously has really hit hard in Brooklyn, where it was concentrated.
And when you say Brooklyn sort of weathered the recession better than New York City as a whole, is that because we already had a higher concentration of Eds and Meds,
yes,
so to speak?
Most likely.
Yeah.
Most likely.
As we look, for the next couple of years, where do you see some of the growth trends here in the borough?
Growth trends, this is where we get into the some educated guesses. I think what we're looking at lately is, first of all, you have the Brooklyn Navy Yard, and the Brooklyn Navy Yard is looking at adding some manufacturing, which should shore up, if not actually grow manufacturing in Brooklyn. I think healthcare is expected to grow, maybe not as fast as it has been growing, mainly because of the issues around the new payer system and the new regulations.
So healthcare is could go either way, right?
Right. As we know, there are a lot of hospitals that are on the chopping block, potentially on the chopping block. So we don't really know which way that's going to go. But chances are we're looking at more ambulatory healthcare and more community care settings in Brooklyn.
And what about sort of self-employment? I mean, there's this sense that in Brooklyn we have a concentration of people who are self-employed.
Well, it's true. About 10%, 9% of all people who are working in Brooklyn are self-employed.
So in that sense, those are Brooklyn jobs too, right?
Yes, that's right.
And what about retail, hospitality? We've seen a growth in hotels, growth in restaurants in the borough. What's the trend?
I think that's we can expect more hotels to be built. We saw a huge increase in hotels and restaurants in Brooklyn over the last decade. And I think the plans are, at least economic development plans, appear to be that we're going to just be seeing more and more growth. Brooklyn is outpacing Manhattan, even in its growth rate, even if it may have slightly fewer hotels and restaurants.
So what's the downside?
The downside? Well, the downside is there are a lot of weak parts of our economy. Generally speaking, not so much in Brooklyn, well, in Brooklyn and generally across the country. You know, we're really not sure. There's a lot of uncertainty around sovereign debt in Europe. That can have an impact on finance. Finance has an impact on a lot of other industries, like black cars, for example. So to the extent that you've got ground transportation, passenger transportation that's here in Brooklyn, you might see some issues around loss of jobs there. I think, you know, the real issue is what's a moneymaker. What will help you send money or bring money in from outside of Brooklyn instead of just churning the money around from people who live there, which is
this notion of traded clusters, right?
Yes,
yeah.
Right. And I think, you know, economic development could play a big role in increasing, for example, the information technology presence in Brooklyn, which we already see to a great deal in Metro Tech. But that seems to be the one sure shot that everybody knows, is that there's more IT and more IT in every industry. So to the extent that IT serves other industries, it would be a great bet for Brooklyn.
So let's talk about this notion of traded clusters, just because I think it's a helpful one for our audience. A traded cluster is when something is created here, whether it's knowledge-based or whether it's product-based or service-based, that could be exported elsewhere, right? So healthcare isn't necessarily a traded cluster. So even though it's growing and it's a large concentration here in Brooklyn, it doesn't necessarily represent the best economic opportunity. Is that accurate?
Well, that's right. I think, you know, you make money when you can actually export to a larger consumer base than you actually have in Brooklyn. And, you know, the typical exports are, you know, obviously you used to have manufacturing. Now we have an awful lot of internal services. Hotels might help. Obviously.
So hotels and restaurant and
right.
hospitality would be a traded cluster.
Yes, that's right. Unfortunately, I think when we're looking at hotels and Eds and Meds, we also are looking at a lot of, you know, of course you have professionals who make an awful lot of money, like doctors and so on, doctors and surgeons, but it's really largely low income, low wage work. And so home health aides, certified nursing aides, paraprofessionals who are teaching, for example, is a lot of low wage work. So I think what we're
the restaurant industry and even retail to some degree gets some criticism in terms of wages. Yes.
Right, absolutely. So, you know, there's a little overlap between internally focused sectors and the wages that they offer. So we could be looking at basically raising the floor if we're looking at bringing in other industries that actually could be export industries.
So when I used to do more of this work and sort of tracked it a little bit more carefully when I was at the Brooklyn Chamber, I'd say about 7 or 8 years ago, it seems like Brooklyn's share of the overall sort of employment base in New York City has grown, and that's probably a good thing, right?
Right.
And is that trend going to continue, do we think?
Well, I think Brooklyn, this is outside of my formal position, but Brooklyn, I think, has become a destination in its own right. And, you know, more people are moving here, and not as an alternative to somewhere else in New York City, but because they want to be here. Same thing with businesses, and I don't see any reason why that wouldn't continue into the future.
So we've seen, you know, Brooklyn's residential base grow, but we're also seeing its business sector grow.
Right.
And that's healthy growth on all fronts.
That's right.
Great. Well, that's good news for the future, and we appreciate you shedding some light on this. Thanks for being here.
Thank you for having me.
Become a fan on Facebook, like Brooklyn Independent Television.